This is the story of Lucas Alderman and his wife Diane Alderman, née Voss. They had been married for 7 years when the story that mattered most was the one neither of them had ever fully told. Lucas was a man who expressed love through action rather than language, through the slow, invisible architecture of provision and protection. And Diane was a woman who had grown so accustomed to stability that she had stopped noticing it was built. Their marriage had the particular quality of a house that has been so well maintained that no one remembers it once needed work, and in that forgetting lived the first crack. Lucas had given everything quietly, and Diane had received everything quietly. And somewhere in the silence between those two things, she had begun to feel alone. What unraveled them was not a single catastrophic failure, but the accumulation of small omissions. Love that never learned how to speak its own name. The kitchen in the Alderman house smelled like coffee and dish soap on Sunday mornings, and Lucas had come to understand that smell as a kind of love language. His own, unspoken. He was the one who made the coffee. He had always been the one who made the coffee. Diane came downstairs at 8:30 in her weekend clothes, her dark hair pulled loosely to one side, and she moved through the kitchen with the particular ease of someone who has inhabited a space so long that she no longer sees it. She kissed him once on the cheek, a dry, habitual press, and reached past him for her mug. "You slept late," he said. "I didn't sleep well." She didn't elaborate. Lucas nodded and turned back to the window above the sink. Outside, the yard was November quiet. A neighbor's dog moved slowly across the far lawn. This was a Saturday morning in the 7th year of their marriage, and it looked exactly like the Saturday morning before it, and the one before that. Lucas did not consider this a problem. He had built his adult life around the principle that consistency was its own form of love. That showing up reliably, day after day, was a more serious declaration than any gesture made in heat. He was 41. He had learned this the hard way, from a first relationship in his mid-20s that had been passionate and shattering in equal measure, and he had resolved, quietly, to never again be the kind of man who loved recklessly. What he had not resolved, or perhaps not noticed, was that Diane might be a different kind of person. She was 38. She had grown up in a family where her father, Gerald Voss, had run a mid-sized logistics and warehousing company with more optimism than capital. Gerald was a warm, expansive man who loved his daughter deeply and managed money with the kind of breezy confidence that tends to precede financial crisis. Diane had inherited his warmth, but not his breezy confidence. She had instead developed a persistent, low-grade anxiety about stability that she masked with surface charm. When she met Lucas, she had found in him something that answered that anxiety. He was solid. He was reliable. He was, she had told her sister once, the kind of man who would never let the ground move under you. She had meant it as a compliment. She was no longer sure she meant it as one. Across town, Gerald Voss's company, Voss Meridian Freight, had been, for the past 4 years, operating on a lifeline that Gerald did not fully understand. He knew there was a silent investor who had come in at a critical moment. A quiet infusion of capital that had stabilized the business without demanding board seats or operational control. The arrangement had been managed through intermediaries. Gerald had asked about the investor twice and been told only that the arranger was clean, the expectations minimal, and the investor wished to remain anonymous. Gerald, who believed fundamentally in good luck as a category, had accepted this. Lucas had never told Diane. He watched her now as she stood at the counter scrolling through her phone, and he noted, not for the first time, that she had stopped doing the things she used to do, which was to show him whatever she was looking at. Small videos, articles, things that made her laugh. She had stopped sharing her phone world with him somewhere around the 5th year, and he had told himself it was simply the natural compression of intimacy over time. Couples stopped narrating themselves to each other. That was normal. Her phone screen tilted slightly away as he glanced over. "Your father called yesterday," Lucas said. "Left a voicemail for you on the landline." "I know. I'll call him back." He sounded good. "He usually does." There was a pause that lasted a few seconds too long. Diane set her mug down, picked up her phone, and said she was going to shower. Lucas listened to her footsteps on the stairs. Then he poured his coffee, stood at the window, and watched the neighbor's dog disappear behind a hedge. He did not yet have a name for what he was feeling. He would have said, if asked, that he felt nothing in particular, but there was something in the way she had tilted the phone screen, something in the practiced, unconscious quality of the gesture that sat at the edge of his awareness like a sound he couldn't quite identify. He finished his coffee. He washed both mugs. He dried them and put them back in the cabinet. That was the Saturday morning. Nothing had happened. Everything was fine. His name was Philip Hart. He came into their life the way most disruptions do, unremarkably, through a reasonable door. Diane had known Philip from before Lucas. They had worked at the same marketing firm in their late 20s, shared lunches, shared grievances about management, and eventually drifted apart the way colleagues do when one of them leaves. He had resurfaced 8 months ago through a professional networking event, a mutual friend's launch party, and Diane had mentioned him to Lucas once, casually, as someone she used to work with. Lucas had registered the name the way you register weather you don't need to dress for. But Philip's name appeared again, in conversation. Briefly, offhandedly. Philip thought the campaign was too safe. Philip recommended this restaurant, and then, more recently, not at all. The absence of a name, Lucas had come to understand, could be louder than its presence. He did not confront this understanding directly. He was not a man who reached for conclusions before they were necessary. What he did instead was pay closer attention. A quiet, measured attention that he recognized in himself as something he had learned from years of financial analysis. You watch. You document. You do not act on a feeling. You act on a pattern. The pattern was this. Diane came home later on Wednesdays. Not dramatically later. 40 minutes, sometimes an hour. She said the same thing each time. Traffic, or a late meeting, or stopping by her friend Nora's. These were explanations that were each individually plausible. Their accumulation was what unsettled him. One evening in January, he came home to find her at the dining table with her laptop open and a glass of wine already half finished. She looked up when he walked in and smiled. And the smile was real. That was the strange thing. Diane was not a person who could manufacture warmth. Whatever else was true, she was genuinely happy to see him. That was what made it complicated. Long day? She asked. Middling. He set his bag down. You? Got a lot done, actually. She turned the laptop toward him and showed him a campaign layout she'd been redesigning. He looked at it carefully, because she deserved that. She was good at her work. Genuinely good, and he had always respected it even when he didn't fully understand it. It's clean, he said. The hierarchy works. She smiled again. That's what I thought. They had dinner. They talked about her father. Gerald's hip had been bothering him, and he was being stubborn about seeing the doctor. They talked about a film they'd been meaning to watch. They did not talk about Philip Hart or Wednesdays or phone screens that tilted away. What Lucas thought, lying awake that night with Diane's breathing quiet beside him, was this. She is not a bad person. He was certain of this. He had chosen her specifically because she was not a bad person, and he trusted his own judgment enough to hold on to it. But he was also certain that something was happening that she had not told him, and that the not telling had its own weight, regardless of what the thing itself turned out to be. What Diane thought, in the brief insomnia before sleep found her, that she was not doing anything wrong. She told herself this specifically. Nothing has happened, nothing has been decided. And the fact that she needed to tell it to herself was something she carefully did not examine. She and Philip had been meeting for coffee, then for lunch. Then once for a walk along the river that lasted 2 hours and covered, between them, the particular territory that unhappy or half-happy people cover when they are drawn toward each other. Complaints softened into confessions, loneliness described as busyness, desire described as nothing at all. She had not kissed him. She had thought about it. She told herself that thinking about it was meaningless, that every person in the long marriage thought about it occasionally, and this was true, and she used the truth of it to avoid the more specific truth, that she had been alone with Philip 4 times now, and had told her husband none of them. She liked how Philip looked at her. That was the simple, embarrassing, entirely human core of it. He looked at her as if she was interesting, as if she might, at any moment, say something worth leaning toward. Lucas looked at her with love. She was sure of that. But it was a love that had become so established, so architecturally load-bearing, that it had lost its hunger. She didn't know, lying in their bed, that the man whose hunger she was mourning had, 4 years earlier, wired $340,000 in capital through a holding company into her father's failing business. She didn't know that he had done it without telling her, because he hadn't wanted her to feel the weight of it, hadn't wanted her gratitude to be obligatory, hadn't wanted the investment to become a kind of debt between them. He had done it simply, quietly, because Gerald Voss was her father, and Gerald's failure would have broken something in her, and Lucas was a man who prevented things from breaking. She had no idea, and that was perhaps the most important thing in the whole story. In February, Lucas saw them. He was driving back from a client lunch, a route he didn't usually take, and he saw Diane and a man walking side by side along the river path. Their shoulders were close, not touching. The proximity was careful in a way that itself communicated intimacy. He recognized her coat, her walk, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands. He drove past. He did not stop. He went home and sat in his office for a long time. And then he did what he always did when confronted with something he needed to understand. He sat with it quietly until the feeling took a shape he could hold. He chose a Thursday evening, 11 days later. Not because he had been building toward it dramatically. There was no speech prepared, no evidence arranged on the table. He chose Thursday because it was an ordinary evening, and he thought an ordinary evening was the right setting for what he needed to say. Drama, he had always believed, distorted things. It gave people something to react to instead of something to answer. Diane was in the kitchen making pasta when he came in. He poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen island and watched her for a moment. The efficient, practiced way she moved, the angle of her shoulders, the dark hair now shorter than it had been when they married. He still found her beautiful. He thought this was worth noting to himself. "Who's Philip Hart?" he said. He said. Her back was to him. He watched the slight pause, a half-second delay in the stirring motion. "You know who Philip is," she said. "I mentioned him. We used to work together. I know you mentioned him. He kept his voice level. I saw you with him, by the river, a couple of weeks ago." She turned then, slowly, and he could see her face doing something complex, the immediate instinct to deny, then the calculation of what he could actually know, then something harder to name. Not guilt exactly. Something more like the look of a person who has been hoping a conversation wouldn't happen and is now adjusting to the fact that it is. "We get coffee sometimes," she said. "I didn't think it was worth mentioning." 4 times? Something crossed her face. "How do you?" "I've been paying attention." He said it without accusation, just as a statement of fact, for a few months. "The Wednesdays. The way you've been with your phone." He took a breath. "I'm not asking you to confess to something you haven't done. I'm asking you to tell me what's happening." She put down the wooden spoon. She leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. Not defensively, he thought, but as though she needed something to hold herself together with. "Nothing has happened," she said. "Physically, nothing. I understand." "Then what are you angry about?" The question was genuine, he realized. She actually wanted to know, and this, more than anything else, told him something. "I'm not angry," he said, and this was true, which surprised them both. "I'm." He considered the word carefully. "Tired." "I think I'm tired of being invisible." Diane flinched. It was small, a slight tightening around the eyes. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "You're not invisible. You're," she paused. "You're everywhere. You're everything. You're the reason this house works and the bills get paid, and Lucas, you know I know that." "I know you know it," he said. "I'm not sure you feel it." She looked at him for a long time. Something was happening in her face that he recognized as genuine, as the actual Diane, rather than the managed Diane, the woman she was when she stopped performing competence. "I feel alone sometimes," she said finally. "I know that doesn't make sense. I know you're here. But I feel like," she looked for the word, "maintained. Like the marriage is maintained, like something that gets checked on rather than wanted." She looked down. "I hear you," he said. "I do. I understand what you're describing." He stood up from the stool and moved to the window, standing with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the dark yard. "But I need you to understand what it means to me that you took that to someone else. Whatever it was. That you let someone else be the one who..." He stopped. "Tried again. I would have wanted to know that you were lonely. That I wasn't. I would have wanted the chance to try. I didn't know how to tell you, she said. Her voice was thinner now. I know. There was a long silence. The pasta water was boiling. Neither of them moved toward it. I think, Lucas said carefully, that I need some time. I'm not talking about ending anything. I'm talking about needing to be somewhere else in my head for a while. He turned to look at her. I'm going to stay at the apartment in the city for a bit. For work, if anyone asks. I just need, Lucas, I need some quiet, he said. Please. She nodded. He couldn't tell if she was relieved or devastated, and he thought perhaps she couldn't tell either. He left the next morning. He had owned a small apartment in the city for years. A studio, really, kept for late nights when clients ran long. It was spared and personal, and he found it, in those first weeks, a relief. He worked early and late. He ate simply. He ran along the waterfront in the cold mornings and thought with the particular clarity that comes from physical exhaustion. He did not think about revenge. He was not, and had never been, that kind of man. What he thought about was the question Diane had asked, not accusingly, genuinely. Then what are you angry about? Because he had said he wasn't angry, and that was true, and the truth of it troubled him. He wondered what it meant that betrayal, or the near shape of betrayal, had produced in him not fury, but something quieter and sadder, like arriving at a destination you'd half expected, and finding that the expectation had taken most of the feeling out of it. He thought about the investment in Gerald's company. He thought about it more than he'd thought about it in years. He had made the decision alone. There was no one to consult, since Diane didn't know about his offshore holding structures, and he hadn't wanted the complexity of the conversation. He had known, when he made it, that he was doing something that Diane should perhaps have been part of deciding. That he was making himself indispensable to her family in a way she didn't know. He had told himself his reasons were clean. He loved her. He loved her father's decency. He had the means. There was no reason not to. These were all true reasons, but he had also kept it from her for 4 years. And that keeping, he turned it over now, carefully, like something that might have a different quality depending on the angle, had its own character. He had given without requiring gratitude. He had provided without being acknowledged. He had built himself into the foundation of her world in a way that guaranteed his own necessity, while remaining invisible. He was not sure now whether that had been entirely selfless. Meanwhile, Diane called twice a week. She kept the calls brief and practical. Logistics, bills, an update about her father's hip. He'd finally seen the doctor. Minor bursitis, easily managed. She did not mention Philip, and Lucas did not ask. He knew from a mutual acquaintance who didn't know enough to be discreet that Diane and Philip had met once more after Lucas left. A brief, apparently uncomfortable encounter that had ended with Philip saying something gentle and reasonable about timing and Diane walking to her car in the rain. There was no great romance there. There had probably never been. That was somehow both better and worse. What Diane was doing, and she knew she was doing it, which was to her credit and also made it more complicated, was rebuilding a narrative, not consciously, not cynically, but with the particular self-protective logic of someone who cannot tolerate being the architect of their own loss. She called Lucas's separateness space he needed. She described his unhappiness to her sister as Lucas going through something. She was not malicious in this. She was simply human, doing what people do when they can't afford to fully see what they've done. She called her father every other day during this period, and Gerald, who noticed nothing and everyone simultaneously, sensed something wrong and was careful not to ask directly. Instead, he invited her for Sunday lunches, cooked extravagantly badly, and told her stories about the early days of the company. He was happy in those months. Business was unusually stable. The silent investor's capital had done its quiet work, and Voss Meridian Freight was growing modestly, reliably, like something that had been given the right conditions. One Sunday in April, Diane sat at her father's kitchen table and watched him move around the kitchen, and felt something that she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to realize it was the feeling of being loved without condition, simply structurally, the way the kitchen itself was familiar, the way Sunday worked. She thought of Lucas. The thought arrived without the usual defensive management she'd been applying to thoughts of him, and it arrived fully. She missed him. Not the idea of him, not the stability of him. Him, The particular way he listened, the particular weight of his presence in a room. She sat with this for a moment, then her phone buzzed, and she picked it up, out of habit, and tilted the screen instinctively before remembering, with sudden clarity, that she was alone. They met in June at their house to discuss what came next. It had been 4 months. Lucas had come back once in March to collect some books and a winter coat, and they had been careful and polite with each other in a way that was its own kind of sadness. Since then, phone calls and a few emails about practical matters. He had continued to manage the mortgage, as he always had, without discussing it. She had continued to leave the porch light on, as she always had, without knowing why. He arrived at 11 in the morning. She had made coffee. He noted this, and the noting told him something about where he still was with her. They sat at the kitchen table. Not the island, where the conversation in February had happened, but the table proper, which felt like a different register of formality. Outside it was warm and gray. The neighbor's dog moved slowly across the far lawn. Older now, the same dog. "I've been thinking about what I want to say," Diane began. "You don't need to prepare something," he said, not unkindly. "I know." She looked at her coffee. "I want to say that I understand what I did. I'm not talking about the technical. I know that I let something in that I shouldn't have, but more than that." She looked up. "I let myself believe that wanting something you weren't giving me excused the looking for it somewhere else, and it didn't." He was quiet. "I also want to say," she hesitated, "I don't think you were invisible. I think I stopped looking." Lucas let this sit. He turned his mug between his palms, the same mug he'd always used, apparently still in the cabinet where he'd put it. "I've been thinking about what I kept from you," he said. She looked at him. "For 4 years," he said carefully, "I've been the silent investor in your father's company." He watched her face. "When Voss Meridian was close to going under, about a year before Gerald ever mentioned anything to you about the finances, I arranged capital through a holding company. Anonymously. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel," he considered the word carefully, "obligated. I wanted to give it without it becoming a debt between us." The kitchen was very quiet. Diane had gone, still in the particular way of someone whose understanding of their own life has just been structurally rearranged. He watched her do it, watched the information arrive in layers. Her father's company. The stability she'd always assumed was Gerald's eventual competence. The 4 years of Sundays at that kitchen table. The extravagant bad cooking. The stories about the early days. The hip that was fine now. The company that had kept growing. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. Her voice was careful. "Because I spent 4 months thinking about why I kept it from you, and I realized that some of my reasons were good and some of them weren't." He was honest about this. It was important to him to be honest. "I told myself it was clean generosity. I think some of it was. But I also think that I kept it because I wanted to be necessary in a way you couldn't see." "Which is," he paused, "not entirely different from what you did." She flinched, and then she looked at him, really looked at him, and something complicated moved across her face. "I would have wanted to know," she said quietly. "I know." "Lucas," she stopped. She put her hands flat on the table. He recognized this gesture from years ago, from early disagreements, from the particular posture of someone who was about to be more honest than is comfortable. "If I had known about my father, about what you were carrying, I don't think I would have felt maintained. I think I would have felt." She searched for it. "Like a person you were protecting, not a house you were upkeeping." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a car moved slowly past. "I think that's probably right," he said. "So we both kept things." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. The recognition between them was real, and it was sad, and it was the most honest thing they had managed in years. "I don't know what we do with that," she said. "I don't either," he said. "Not yet." He stayed for another hour. They talked about her father. He told her the full details of the investment, the amount, the structure, the intermediary, and she listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of grace. When he left, he stood at the front door for a moment, and she stood in the hallway, and the space between them was exactly the length of everything they had withheld. "I'll call," he said. "Okay," she said. He walked to his car. She watched him from the window, the same window he had stood at in November with his coffee, watching the dog move across the far lawn. The yard was green now. A different season. She did not know if he would call. She did not know exactly what she hoped. What she understood, standing at the window in the June gray, was that they had each, in their own particular way, loved the other in the dark. Lucas by building invisible structures, Diane by needing light from another source, and that neither of them had been entirely wrong in what they'd needed, and neither had been blameless in how they'd sought it. Some marriages end, some pause, and some of what pauses eventually finds a way to continue, changed. And some things simply remain unresolved in the way that important things often do. Held between two people without verdict, without the comfort of a clear conclusion, like a question whose value is not in the answering but in having been, finally, honestly asked. The car pulled away. The street was quiet. The dog was gone. The mine knew, the mile of Hillman ben Hewell.